I'm sitting here, pondering in front of my laptop, searching for words, because I'm baffled at the state of the Metal Gear series right now, or more specifically, the fan base, and how it has received the newest entry in the beloved series, Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater. A game promised by Konami, beloved company that it is, to update Snake Eater and drag it kicking and screaming onto the 9th generation of consoles, and also PC, even though it's already there because of the Master Collection, but who even cares about that? To modernize it for a gaming audience that has forgotten the respect that the name Metal Gear once carried with it. I wonder whose fault that is. Anyway, thus came Delta, wrapped in the gorgeous, shiny new Unreal Engine 5, containing a gameplay system that's a beautiful blend of the original Snake Eater and Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. And besides these two things, changing nothing about the original package. It retains Snake vs. Monkey and the Guy Savage minigame, two things that have been sorely missed in other versions of Snake Eater. It keeps the original script and voice acting, cutscenes, music, and, naturally, story. It keeps the map design, it keeps the enemy design, it keeps the weapons, it keeps the camo, but all of these things have been updated to match modern sensibilities. Delta is, for all intents and purposes, Snake Eater. Except it isn't. It's a mediocre game. And it's a way worse remake than the game that nearly every Metal Gear fan will tell you to avoid like the plague. If you'll give me the time, I'd be happy to explain why. I promise this is an important question to ask, not just because it's going to shape a lot of my criticism for Delta and praise for the Twin Snakes, but because the label of remake is so broad that it's basically impossible for you to get a good idea of what something that's labeled as a remake is even going for in the first place. Is it intending to update the original for modern audiences? Is it a new director taking a stab at a classic story and putting their own spin on it? Is it aiming to be shot for shot, replicating the original in as faithful a way as possible? We can already tell what Delta's aiming for. It's right there on the box and all of the marketing. The game is going to be Snake Eater again. But here's the thing. It's trying to have its cake and eat it too, because it's also claiming to be a total reinvention of Snake Eater. The fact of the matter is that it cannot be both. The game is trying to be a shot-for-shot remake, but with an entirely different game feel. The maps, voice acting, cutscenes, and camo options are all the same, and yet the gameplay is entirely different from the original. It is fundamentally impossible to inspire the same feelings as the original experience when the act of playing the game is so different. Hell, I think it's impossible to replicate the original experience even if you just make the most literal shot-for-shot remake possible. Remade art still exists in conversation with the original piece. But that's besides the point. Delta is trying to be two different things at once. Bad place to start from, but what about the other subject of this video? Put simply, Twin Snakes is attempting to be a completely different experience from the original Metal Gear Solid. It isn't trying to present the same material, it isn't trying to inspire the same emotional responses, it isn't even trying to replicate the feeling of playing the original game. In every conceivable way, it's trying to be as little like Metal Gear Solid as possible, while still being recognizable as Metal Gear Solid. This is where the discussion gets interesting. I would argue that the Twin Snakes is less of a remake and more of an adaptation, which is especially funny considering that the opening credits for Delta call it based on Metal Gear Solid 3. But once again, Twin Snakes is all the better for that. Like I said, it's not trying to replicate Metal Gear Solid. It's trying to take this game from merely 5 years ago, yet already so antiquated in the midst of the fastest period of innovation in gaming history, and reimagine it as a brand spanking new game in the year 2003. In a way, this is one of the most faithful ways one could remake MGS. The game prides itself on being forward-thinking, on being one of the most important factors in revolutionizing video gaming forever. And so, the Twin Snakes tries to bring it out of its old husk and reinvent it as a shiny new product, still as impressive as it was in 1998. And it's here that we can already see a major reason for why this game would be so divisive. It can't be as revolutionary as Metal Gear Solid. For all the technical improvements it receives, for all the trends it shamelessly apes to make itself more contemporary, none of these things can replicate the sheer upgrade that MGS was over basically every other narrative-focused game at the time. If anything, abiding by contemporary standards for modern and cool only served to date Twin Snakes in hindsight. It can't invent good cinematography. It can't invent good voice acting. It can't invent all the twists in a story that already exists. All it can do is rub some WD-40 on the squeaky joints and polish the original to a mirror sheen. It's this era of gaming's The Last of Us Part 1. a game that solely exists to ride on the wave of a popular sequel by making the previous installment look more like it. But that's where discussion usually ends. And that's a crying shame, because that isn't what Twin Snakes is doing. At least that's not all it's doing. So let's move on from the philosophical bullshit and get into the games themselves. This is probably one of the most important talking points to lay out about each game because it might be one of Twin Snakes' biggest strengths and one of Delta's biggest weaknesses. Neither of these games were built from the bottom up as remakes of their respective games. They both borrow heavily from the previous game in the Metal Gear series for mechanical and aesthetic purposes. While this is a way of accurately describing Delta, it doesn't properly convey the inherent confusion it inspires by just having played a Metal Gear game before. More specifically, MGS5, the game it draws the most from in a mechanical sense. Like I said, the engine it uses is Unreal 5, but most of Snake's abilities come from the Phantom Pain. This does not include the crouch walk and third-person aiming, which was technically added in MGS 3DS, being that game was built on Peace Walker's engine. What it does include is smoother versions of both of these things, as well as the re-addition of first-person aim, but those things alone aren't enough to make it just feel like playing as Venom in Selino Yarsk. Aside from that, there's the new addition of the Quick Swap camo, which eliminates the need to revisit the survival viewer quite as much. You'll still need to create your preferred outfits manually, and of course curing and eating are still in the survival viewer, but this addition is still nice to have. Of course, there is also the matter of actually controlling Snake, but I'll get to that later. For now, just know that the game doesn't immediately feel like MGS3 or MGS5, and that feeling is quite alienating for a Legacy fan. One huge addition to the game is actually given to the enemies, and it's not a positive one. They now use a mixture of recreated animations from the original game, some animations ripped directly from it, and a heavy amount of recycled animations from MGS5. Here's the issue. Their AI and pathing is still based on MGS3, not V. What this means is that whenever they move in their normal routes, they'll work pretty much fine, but if they move somewhere to investigate, and especially during combat, they'll use the MGS5 animations, which aren't suited to the tracks they're on. So they'll constantly snap to individual angles when moving around corners since they can't turn on a dime, and when making minute movements, they're likely to overstep their destination, meaning they'll turn around and you risk getting spotted for no reason. Likewise, during combat, they'll now run much faster around the battlefield, which often results in them clumping together to be easily dispatched with a grenade. Combine that with how slowly Snake moves while aiming, not to mention how heavy he feels to move around, and the tense firefights from the original have been turned into really shitty airsoft RP from a bunch of r/gun porn users. Is that a real subreddit? I don't care. Twin Snakes, on the other hand, is quite simple to understand on a foundational level. It reuses the engine and mechanics of MGS2 in order to construct its version of Shadow Moses. The way Snake controls and the way the game works in a technical sense are ripped wholesale from MGS2. The models used have basic lip flap and cutscenes and interact with the environment dynamically in gameplay in a variety of ways. There are naturally several set pieces that have been constructed entirely independent of MGS2, such as the lava hazard, the rappelling segment, rooms that involve gas, but these things aren't such foreign concepts that they really need explaining. Just listing things out like this makes it feel like I'm sort of freaking out over a cool rock or something. But this is one of the biggest differences between Delta and Twin Snakes. Delta being built entirely on top of the original game without needing to repurpose something else in order to do so means that not only isn't there anything new to look forward to, it's not interesting to see the things getting remade. It's just the original stages and assets remade in UE5, and no special considerations have to be made for anything. Not to mention photorealism is such a tired aesthetic in the current day. It's not interesting to see what a fake jungle would look like if it looked more like a real jungle. Contrast that with Twin Snakes, where there's an inherent wow factor to seeing these new things in the MGS2 engine. The aesthetic being so different from MGS2, with the dark corridors and stone surfaces and heavily reworked lighting, it all makes these environments feel like they were made from the ground up in the image of MGS1, instead of that game getting what amounts to a texture overhaul. Seeing that 2 already remade so many things from the first Solid game, it also works on a metatextual thematic level for this engine to finally recreate the rest of MGS1, like a closed loop finally reaching its end at the beginning, the snake consuming its own tail and all that. And this is naturally where we end up with another common criticism of Twin Snakes. The fact that MGS1 wasn't built to facilitate the host of new features added in its sequel. This is an objective fact. Rail hopping, first-person aiming, hell, just the simple act of rolling isn't something MGS1 is prepared to challenge. And these things do inherently change the way you navigate rooms and deal with enemies. Notice that nowhere in this sentence have I said the part where this is a bad thing. That's because, for the most part, I don't consider it one. I have two key reasons as to why, and both of these things can be applied to Delta as well, in the sense that it doesn't do these things. First reason, Twin Snakes changes the layout of Shadow Moses in a few key ways to make these additions feel a little more comfortable. People's go-to example of rail hopping being a way to break the game is in the tank hangar, where you can easily exit the upper platform and end up right in front of the cargo door. This is true, you can do that, but making a part of the game meant to be placed towards the very beginning a bit easier to navigate doesn't exactly strike me as a good reason to say the entire mechanic being present makes the game feel brainless. If anything, it's training you to keep an eye out for rails like that for future use, since some rails can't be jumped over, which you'll quickly see in the observation area for the nuke building. It also ignores the several places where rail hopping feels well integrated into the environment. Take the blast furnace, for example. Hopping the rail overlooking that little alcove full of cameras is doable, but going straight from that rail to the ground means you'll take damage on your way, and the stun time makes you more likely to be spotted and shot. But if you're attentive, you'll see the rope hanging above the ground, which you can drop down to and grab, which then means you won't take damage from the fall. Several other areas in the game received similar alterations, added enemies for challenge, adjusted environments for new interactivity, but I'll get to them when I get to them. These things are also true of rolling and first-person aim, despite how much people will parrot those tired talking points of how they make the game too easy because of the second reason. The enemies got upgrades too. No longer are they the hilariously incapable, nearsighted, short-term memory-having dummies that are only dangerous because of how poorly Snake controls. In Twin Snakes, they're using the same AI and tools as the dangerous, organized, still sort of nearsighted Gerlukovich commandos. That means you can no longer hang around just outside their vision cone or one floor above or below them and remain unseen. It means you can no longer safely unload the FAMAS into ambushing enemies if you get spotted. It means some patrolling enemies cannot be disposed of without a retaliation from HQ, and their bodies are now something you need to keep in mind when you're moving through an area. Granted, first-person aim still does trivialize a lot of the stealth, but you're lying to yourself if you don't extend this exact same criticism to literally every other game in the series with a silent ranged weapon. That being all of them. MGS2 especially is a victim to a lot of intended challenge just disappearing if you unload your Mark 22 into the head of every enemy you see. As such, I don't consider this a significant blow against Twin Snakes, for the same reason I don't consider it a significant blow against the other games. You can choose up the difficulty, and it's arguably better here than in MGS2, because you can keep the Soliton radar on extreme difficulty and retain some very necessary spatial awareness in the game's tightest corridors and most claustrophobic combat encounters. Keep all of these things in mind when I tell you that Delta contains none of these considerations. The environments have not been changed to accommodate the increased movement capabilities or the altered third-person camera, which for the record is downright abysmal. You can't see shit around you when you're in an enclosed environment, and while crouch walking, you might as well be wearing horse blinders. When both Subsistence and the original version of the game never suffered from this, even with the legacy camera limitations, I consider that a genuine problem. Also a genuine problem is the lack of an FOV slider, meaning you are stuck with whatever camera Konami decided you get on this flip of the coin. It's not a creative challenge to have you do an obstacle course, then give you the exact same course, except now you're wearing drunk goggles. Even with the camera though, Snake is so absurdly capable that you may as well be playing with God mode on. The simple ability to move in first person fundamentally changes the way you interact with these spaces, and none of them have been changed to reflect it. It's a similar problem that MGS1 Integral faced. It makes for a fun gimmick, but the game is now completely different for having it. The worst problem though is the modernized shooting controls, which means now you don't have to put any extra consideration into attacking enemies. You just face them with the same offhanded, nonchalant attitude you would in any other game where to shoot an enemy you point and click. Likewise, the enemies cannot counter your newfound mobility and perception due to all the aforementioned tweaking their movement received and their AI didn't receive. If these were enemies ported wholesale from MGS5 with increased perception, quicker reaction times, and enhanced aggression, then maybe they'd stand a chance. But neither GRU nor Spetsnaz are prepared for a soldier from 20 years in the future to be popping off headshots like you're going for the big stuffed animal prize at the carnival. I keep getting closer and closer to talking about the controls in more depth, so let's actually burst that bubble while I'm on the subject. Because once again, it's an area where both games are flawed, but while one shines through the rough, The other just confuses me as to how it was so messed up in the first place. Put bluntly, Twin Snakes feels like a dream to control, only you're on Benadryl and having trouble remembering which limb does what, whereas Delta feels like someone who had never made a Metal Gear game before tried to make the controls of Snake Eater work with the controls of the Phantom Pain. Let's start with what's probably the hotter take. At the end of the day, Twin Snakes uses the same controls from MGS2, only missing a button. Sort of. Thanks to that dastardly GameCube controller, and fuck it, I'm just gonna go on a quick tangent here. The GameCube controller fucking sucks. Like, straight up booty butt cheeks. Guys, wow, look at these giant clicky analog triggers. That sure makes up for a weird system of one button in the middle and 3 buttons around it like a V-Smile controller. That sure does make up for the worst shoulder button I've ever seen on a controller ever. That sure makes up for the C-stick being so small it'll slide between the molecules of your thumb. That sure makes up for the D-pad somehow being even smaller than that. If I could please get some kind of sign from the big thumb having community that I'm not insane for hating this controller, please give it to me. Anyway, this controller ruins the control scheme. Because how the hell do you organize the buttons when one of them is suddenly way more important than the others? Me personally, I would have put the stance button on A, shooting on B, punching on Y, and interacting on X. I feel like that would have worked mostly okay, but I get why they did it the way they did. At the end of the day, your main form of offense is worth being put on the largest button, and everything still being accessible around it means you're not totally incapable. But because of this, it now means you're going to get a classic case of controller schizophrenia whenever you go to do anything for a while. For especially the first half of the game, I was battling muscle memory. I just kept thinking to myself, if only there was some way I could remap the control binding so I could put the buttons in normal places. But even that wouldn't fix every problem, because there's some functions that are tied to the buttons themselves, not the button actions, such as confirm and cancel. You remember the pain of thinking confirm was on X when it was really on circle? Well, now confirm's on your shoot button, so even if you actually could remap the buttons, too bad, you use the square button to say yes. Similar problem with only having a start button, and this one doesn't even make sense to me. The Nintendo 64 controller and the SNES controller both had a select button. Why the fuck doesn't the GameCube controller have that? Because of this, the codec is now on A+ start. Except wait, for some unexplainable reason, they also got rid of the pause button in this game. So why isn't the codec just on start? Start doesn't do anything on its own now. It just doesn't make sense to me that they'd shit the bed that hard with the controls. But I will say this, for as bad as the controls can be in Twin Snakes, they're still at least somewhat based in reality. They have functions that we're used to having mapped to buttons one could imagine them being on. And like I said, only the first half of the game saw me struggling with them. Once I'd gotten used to them, I was basically playing MGS2 again, and MGS2 has some of the best controls in the series. These controls don't hold a candle to Delta, and I'll confirm that with one simple statement. So the game feels a lot like MGS5, right? That's the most recent game in the series, so, it makes sense. They base the controls on that because it makes sense. Stance on cross, reload on circle, diving on square, triangle being interact. Hell, cross and triangle have always been stance and interact. Except in MGS1 because triangle was first person, but they were still filling out the proper controller back then. It's not something that bothers me too much. The main difference here is that the triggers and bumpers have new utilities, with the D-pad being how you select weapons. For the game MGS5 is, these alterations make perfect sense, and follow up on Peace Walker's previous alterations by adding the triggers to the equation. They're great controls. Fantastic controls. So here's that statement I alluded to earlier. In Delta, you roll by pressing triangle. Let me repeat. Triangle is the roll button. Cross is now the interact button, which means that stance is on circle. Words cannot express how little sense this makes. As someone who's played a Metal Gear game before, watching the controls get mutilated like this on a normal controller, especially when we already had good Snake Eater controls on normal controllers with the Xbox version of the HD collection, it's just baffling. Befuddling. Roll is on triangle. And that's another thing, by the way, the roll is back, not the dive, which made sense for the faster-paced game that MGS5 is. Not that I'd want the dive in this game, as it is, because the pace has been artificially slowed down from 5 to better suit the smaller environments. I think that was the goal anyway, but even if it was the goal, how does making Snake feel this sluggish make these updated controls feel any more at home in environments that weren't meant to be explored this way? But legacy style though, that's what you're saying, right? Those are the words on your tongue thrashing against the screen, begging me to admit defeat, because in legacy style, the controls are the same as the original, right? Wrong. Wrongest wrong to ever wrong. Not only is shooting still on the triggers and square only works to reload, but such minor things now make zero sense. Naturally, you can't move in first person, but that hasn't changed the fact that aiming is still on the right stick, and the left stick is now what you use to lean. You also cannot rotate while aiming in third person unless you're circling an enemy you're holding up, meaning the best you can do is strafe in a circle while you point in exactly one direction. Also, this is where it's easiest to see that the movement speed has been reduced from the original game. Strafing is faster than walking in a straight line. Also, L2 is basically worthless because partly holding down R2 will allow you to aim your weapon. This means that to shoot the weapon, you have to release R2. Imagine any shooter. Now imagine that aiming is holding down the right mouse button, but in order to fire the gun, you need to tap and then let go of the left mouse button. Wouldn't that suck? Wouldn't that be the worst thing ever? And I remind, this is in legacy style. This is where you go to get something even closer to the original experience than Delta's already going for. And not only is crouch walking still a thing, not only is crawling now painfully slow, not only are you only able to look around in first person with the right stick, and you can't even look up and down in tall grass anymore, it doesn't even feel comparable to new style because of the roll being back on cross and CQC being back on circle. But don't worry guys, square is still only for reloading. Thank goodness. You have to completely rewire your brain every time you switch from new to legacy, and at that rate, why even play this cheap imitation of Snake Eater, which doesn't even have the subsistence camera, mind, you only get the PS2 original overhead view here. There's so many other downgrades I'm not even gonna bother mentioning because, Jesus Christ, why play this over the original? I cannot think of a reason. Actually, no, I lied. There is one more thing I need to mention of the controls before I move on to anything else, and that's CQC. In the original, it's pretty simple, but allows for fun depth. Circle punches, hold circle to grab, hold while moving to slam. You can run up on enemies and tap them to stun them for a moment, then readjust and gather your bearings to plan your next course of action. You can kick enemies while standing off of ledges for a quick disposal of a body that might otherwise impede your progress. You know exactly how long you'll be incapacitated for while you're disabling your immediate foe. CQC is a well-oiled machine that you can have absolute control over, and it greatly enhances the gameplay experience. In Delta, naturally it's a new video game, CQC comes down to a button prompt, where in the original, CQC was generous with how far away you had to be, because depth perception is difficult in any video game, much less in the original with those overhead angles. In Delta, the CQC button will only appear when you're sniffing the enemy's ass. When the CQC button's on screen, you can hold down R2 for what feels like way too much time, and then eventually Snake will grab the enemy. This is done in what feels like a cutscene, unless the game forgets to change the camera angle, and then it feels really cool because it's gameplay, and I feel like I just did the cool thing. From there, options are mostly the same, barring pressure-sensitive button nonsense, which I've never been very fond of. It's the slam where things get insane. To slam an enemy, you have to be moving, and then you press R2. Not hold, press. This means you can no longer run up at an enemy and punch them because Snake will default to slamming unless his motion has completely halted, which is really hard to tell with the added movement inertia. So if you want to grab the enemy, you need to very specifically stalk up behind them, now done by, of course, holding a button, because any quicker movement will be heard without the DLC suit, and you can't be sure you'll grab the enemy when you're moving at all. If you want to punch them, you not only need to do the same things with your movement, you need to hope that your punch actually connects with the enemy, because if it doesn't, it takes so long for the animation to end and movement to become a thing you can do that you should just start praying the enemy didn't hear you coming up behind them. And even if it works, there's basically no need to single punch enemies because the process of manually knocking them out with your fists is so slow and clunky that it's just more trouble than it's worth. And by the way, have you noticed how stupid the new punching animation looks? where in every single previous game, an assortment of strikes are thrown at various places on the body, Snake now throws two of the worst straight punches I've ever seen in my life, or slaps the enemy with the barrel of his gun, and then kicks with the same leg he just punched with, which is just terrible form, as shown by the fact that he never did that in any previous game except in Snake Eater, where he only did it if he punches while holding a grenade. This is what happens when you have the Yakuza moveset autism. So why haven't people complained about how blatantly worse this system is? You don't know? Well, I'll tell you why.
You enjoy all the
graphics.
That's why.
It's because there's a whole host of new, pretty CQC slam animations to play around with, depending on how you approach the enemy and how they react to your approach. They look incredible. They feel satisfying to watch and pull off. It's because the forest is really pretty now, and the photorealistic textures and updated animations for the critters you'll run into add a lot to the immediate immersion. It's because, technically speaking, the game looks better. Technically, the game looks great. And for a lot of people, technically is what matters the most. But if you pay attention for any amount of time to any of the smaller details, you have to accept that it just doesn't look that good. And big shock, one of the biggest problems with it is the animation. Nearly everything in the game looks good except for that. And without that, the game looks bad. As a Yakuza series vet, trust me when I say that. Because when we get to the cutscenes in this game, we're dealing with straight up Snake Eater Kiwami levels of lame. First major problem's already been said. The reused animations on the enemies end up making them unable to properly navigate the environments the game has. When you've seen these animations for as long as anyone who has over 90% completion in MGS5, you'll be able to spot them in a heartbeat. And watching the enemies in this game constantly bounce between new to reused from 5 to the rare reused Snake Eater animations, it just rips you out of the game entirely. Second major problem is the new animations given to Snake. Not necessarily all of them. In fact, it's the smallest ones that give me issue. As I mentioned earlier, this game now has movement inertia, so you can't instantly run at full speed, which, by the way, the running animation is also reused from 5 when you're not holding a weapon, so you can more easily notice how much slower it is here. More importantly, you can't go straight from running to no motion. This makes precise movement pretty much impossible, which really sucks in places like the swamps and any indoor environment where you really don't want to fall off a ledge or end up with your head sticking out around a corner. Of course, you could hug the wall, but this has its own problems, mainly that I never want to hug the wall because Snake somehow moves even slower there compared to normally. Again, same animation from 5 and sometimes Snake Eater, but unbearably slowed down. I've got half a mind to say that whether you're allowed to press yourself against a wall literally comes down to whether they coded the wall to let you do that. You know how trees in the original game are really clunky with whether or not you'll be allowed to press yourself against it as long as you're on the right side? The walls in this game all feel like that. Just sometimes you can, and on the ones you'd want to, you can, but maybe I feel like doing my own thing? One new animation is the roll, but there's a half-second startup period after hitting the button, so what was once a responsive, immediate movement and melee option will now often get you hit when you try to roll through an attacking enemy. Easily my least favorite new animation for Snake is getting up from a crawl while moving. Like in 5, you can retain your movement in a specific direction, but unlike 5, you cannot turn for the entire time Snake is getting up. In that time, the enemy on top of you could just keep shooting you, or at worst, melee hit you and knock you right back over. This wouldn't be such a huge problem if Delta didn't inherit V's default, where you won't immediately get up after being knocked down. However, what it didn't inherit that made V tolerable is an option for ground melee. You cannot knock over the enemy standing right in front of you when you're on the ground. You can either crawl away slowly, stand up on the spot, or attempt to do both of those things because tensions are running a little high, you're getting shot at right now. Slowly stand and walk towards your assailant and get your ass put right back on the ground. I mean no exaggeration when I say that this is infuriating. Add on to this the CQC woes and the insane button mapping, and I would call this the worst controlling Metal Gear game in the entire series, including Survive. That game also had interact on cross and stance on circle, so maybe they based it on this and not 5. But at least the CQC works the way it's supposed to. Not to mention the inventory system was updated from 5, and I really like how it works here. I meant it in that other video when I said I don't hate Survive. The third major reason is the cutscenes, as in all of them. They all look bad. There's a multitude of contributing factors to that assessment, but of course, the most important thing is the animations. Criticizing the cutscenes in a Metal Gear game, especially the action choreography, is a quick route to getting your opinion completely disregarded, except for Twin Snakes, of course, because MGS1's a perfect game and doing it any differently is literally an affront to nature. All of that said, I have to come right out and say it. The PS2 cutscenes are dated. Of course, far less dated than the MGS1 cutscenes, but still, they don't hold up perfectly today. Nothing does. Faces couldn't express a lot of nuanced emotion back in this era, and I stress, nuanced. They can do grins and grimaces just fine, but a lot of extra acting had to be done with the limbs and voice to make up for a lack of facial expressions. As such, emotions are very hyperbolic, and the action is to match, because bigger is easier to write and portray. This isn't necessarily a net negative for the Snake Eater cutscenes, but it does mean that in a modernized remake, I would have wanted those things to just be slightly toned down. It looks uncanny for these lifelike models to do anime head turns and arm motions, if that makes sense. Things like the Granin cutscenes are a perfect example of this. With no actual things to do on screen besides convey their thoughts, Snake and Granin are physically overacting so hard in certain moments that it just comes off like a high school theater production. No shade to high school theater, but this isn't that, so it shouldn't be that. Also, key part of why the Delta cutscenes look so weird, the new English lip motions just feel out of place. The hyper-specific motions of their mouths contrast so severely with the stiff, jolty movements with the rest of their bodies. It just feels wrong. And by the way, I hope you like having the English lip flap, because they didn't make ones for the Japanese one. Just like MGS5, there is no Japanese lip flap, so if you're playing the game in Japanese now, it's gonna look weird. Because we can't just make it look normal for both of them, one of us has to get the short end of the stick. And all of that's not even to mention no extra movement was added to the rest of the face, so you've got these super well animated mouths while everything from the nose up is often barely moving at all. Any scenes of really well portrayed emotion are entirely due to the original game looking that good, and of course they all look better there than here. Then of course there's the action scenes, which just look stilted with all the modern models and graphics. The devil's in the details, so it can be easy to ignore, but if you regularly watch movies or just have a discerning eye for these things, they stick out like a sore thumb. Stuff like Ocelot's gun rotating by very obvious increments when he spins it around in the holster, the really weird way characters run, especially any moment where in-game animations are used, like Snake falling off the bridge at the end of the Virtuous mission. None of these things feel particularly awkward in the original because they fit the aesthetic of the game. But when the game's entire aesthetic has been fundamentally altered, they no longer fit. And there's the runner-up in fatal blows to these cutscenes behind animations. The aesthetics haven't just been changed, they're completely removed. In that same cutscene where Ocelot's gun looks weird, there's a striking lack of impact in the bike knocking him over, and doubly so in the scene where Snake fights off the Ocelot single-handedly. Have you noticed what's missing yet? In the original, slow-motion action is emphasized with after-images and heavy but precise blur effects. In Delta, the after-images are completely gone, and moments like Ocelot walking up on Snake and the Gru soldiers now looks really stupid without making it clear this is meant to be in slow motion. Nearly every action scene in the game suffers for lacking these things, and those are usually the scenes people will point to in the original when they're talking about how good the game looks. Something Delta adds that it really didn't need to is a heavy amount of motion blur to very specific moments in cutscenes. Ocelot's gun spinning in the original looks really good because most of the effects on the guns are after images. It gives off the effect of motion blur without actually obscuring any of what's going on. But that exact same scene in Delta just looks really awkward with the blur on the guns and everything else basically in focus. And that one thing is enough to take you out of the moment and make you realize that these are some really, really long shots on him just standing there spinning those guns. Again, I don't have a problem with the original cutscene at all, but the lack of updates to make it fit in Delta's new aesthetic just makes it stick out. And you know what else Delta adds? Pop in, frame drops, a lot of both of those things, especially whenever the really weird unaltered crossfade transitions happen. I can't believe a game released in current year would be unable to handle cutscene transitions, but there you go. On the subject of removed aesthetics, there's also the lighting. It's always the lighting, dude. So many cutscenes and set pieces in games in general suffer for poor lighting, and the ones in this game suffer greatly for lacking the lighting that the original game already had. And yeah, I know there's a legacy filter, it affects cutscenes, it makes most of them look comparable to the original game. You know what it doesn't fix? Any of the other things I've been talking about. And that's not to mention the several new filters that do nothing to fix the lack of expressive and creative lighting choices in this game. I don't even need to say anything. You could just look at this with your eyes and understand that one of these looks really evocative and the other one looks like Hunt Down the Freeman. So I'm gonna ask again, why the hell am I playing this game over MGS3 if there's barely anything different about it, all of those new things suck, and the only time it's even close to good is when it's doing its best to emulate the original experience? Yet again, I cannot think of an answer. In terms of meaningful additions, you're paying for worse aesthetics, worse controls, slightly different bosses, an unlock system for the gag reels that feels like a worse version of MGS2's dog tags, only 3 new ones on top of that, the expanded Snake vs. Monkey that was already in subsistence but removed in the HD collection, a semi-interesting character action game that they outsourced to Platinum instead of actually trying to make this game work with that kind of design, and a multiplayer mode that isn't even out yet as of the recording of this video, and has been made very clear that it won't be as good as the MGOs from previous games. Is that package worth $70? Is that worth $85 for the added benefit of camos that completely destroy the game balance when the original has been made more accessible now than it has ever been? I think not. So you may notice that I've spent basically none of this chapter talking about Twin Snakes. That's because I wanted to get the rest of the things I had to say about Delta's biggest problems out of the way while I've got them on the brain. Not to mention, this is basically all the game has to offer. Take out all the stuff that's straight lifted from Snake Eater, and what's left isn't enough to make a good game. Hell, it's barely enough to make an actual different game. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't make for a good remake in my eyes. So, if you got the stomach for it, let's get into the rest of this shit, and I'll make a case for why Twin Snakes is, if nothing else, a better remake than Delta is. Oh shit, sorry guys, you better go ahead and swap the discs. That wasn't really anticipating this being a problem, but you're gonna have to go ahead and do that. In the second now, you'll be swapping the disc, and we can get right back into the discussion. Any second now.